I'm June Zeitlin. I'm with the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights based in Washington, D.C., and it's my honor to be moderating this panel on culture, religion, and human rights, applying what we have learned. I'd just like to say briefly a few remarks that frame the panel discussion, and then I'm going to turn it over to my esteemed panelists. But I want to remind everybody that one of the outcomes of this day-long discussion is to make recommendations to UN Women. And I can think of no area more important to make recommendations to UN Women than around culture, religion, and human rights. So I'm hoping, I know our panelists in their remarks and in the question and answer session, we can focus to some extent on these objectives, because obviously culture and religion need to be considered within the human rights framework, and the human rights framework has to be at the heart of UN Women. For many of the people in this room, Charlotte and others, all of us who worked on UN Women, we saw it as a transformational moment and a transformational organization. And so it's really critical that that leadership continue as we discuss these challenging questions of culture and religion, but mindful that it is within the human rights framework. So as we go forward, we're going to be talking about not only women's rights are human rights and human rights as women's rights. It was repeated, I can't tell you how many times at the launch of UN Women. And also talking about CEDAW, which is the most comprehensive women's human rights treaty. But this is the background under which we want to have this discussion today, and we want to help guide and advise UN Women as it moves forward. Finally, I just want to say these are issues that are really important in the United States, as well as in the countries that people here come from around the world and that some of our panelists are going to talk about. But certainly culture, we've had our own culture wars here. Religion, the U.S. is among the most religious countries in the entire world. So these are issues and challenges that we all face day to day, and it's something, again, that we want to remember as we're talking about different parts of the world and how women and men are grappling with these challenges. So let me introduce our panelists. Our first speaker is going to be Karima Ben-Noon. She's from Algeria and also lives here in the U.S. and is a professor of law at Rutgers School of Law. Karima has just come back from a trip to Algeria, and I know everyone's going to be really anxious to hear what she saw and experienced there. Karima is going to be followed by Leila Ahmed. Leila is a professor at Harvard Divinity School. She's also Egyptian as well as living here in the United States. And then finally, Frances Kissling. I guess I have to say she's just American, but she also lives part-time in Mexico. So, and as you all know, Frances was the longtime head of Catholics for Choice, and she's now a visiting scholar at the Center for Bioethics at the University of Pennsylvania. You can find much more about their bios. I could talk for the next hour about all their accomplishments, but some of that is in your program. And I just want to note that Radhika Kumaraswamy, who was listed on the program, unfortunately could not be here. She had a personal emergency that she had to attend to. So we're very sorry, but we understand the balance of life and work is something women face all the time. So without further ado, I'm going to turn to Karima.
Good afternoon. I wanted to start off by showing you a very short DVD of pictures and sound from a recent protest in Algeria. I'd really like to thank the organizers for inviting me today. It's an honor to be a part of this event, and I want to speak about something that I believe is critical in the work of UN Women, and that is a vigorous championing of universality without exception. And I would like to do that in the context of the amazing people power movements we're witnessing around the world, from Morocco to Iran, from China to Sudan, and especially in North Africa. Women are playing critical roles in these movements, and I think that's something we really need to reflect upon as we think about the work of UN Women moving forward. I've just returned from Algeria on Sunday, and I had the tremendous honor of observing two of the opposition protests on February 12th and 19th, which were inspired by the heroic Tunisian and Egyptian revolutions in which women played critical roles. Many women were involved in the Algerian demonstrations, which called for a lifting of the 19-year-old state of emergency, which did take place 2 days ago. So already a victory, but I'll say more about what that means, victory in brackets, for the protest movement. But they also called for nothing less than a total change in Algeria's political system. The single most moving part of the February 12th March for Change, from which you saw pictures, was the women's demonstration. About 30,000 police officers had tried to shut down a demonstration of some 2,000 women and men close to 1st of May Square in Algiers, and at a certain point the feminist activists had had enough of this. And as you saw, they took up a position on the sidewalk with Algerian flags, singing the national anthem, chanting slogans for social change, for gender justice, for social justice, and they absolutely refused to be removed from the space. One of the women involved, the prominent psychologist Sharifa Bouata, told me the day before, as we watched the celebrations in Cairo after the fall of Mubarak on television, she said, "I have been waiting for this for years. This is the beginning. From the years of the fundamentalist terrorism of the 1990s and what came after here, everything seemed lost. Our hopes for a just society were dying, but now the possibilities are fantastic." On February 12th, near 1st of May Square, Algeria's Little Tahrir, as some have called it, Sharifa Bouata and the other women explored these possibilities, and they refused to cede to the police. The young pro-government counter-protesters, who, like in Egypt, seem to have been hired by the authorities, repeatedly confronted the women. They really targeted the women protesters, and even at one point began shouting in favor of an Islamic state as a sort of direct riposte to the women and their cries for abrogating the family code. The most surreal moment of that February 12th demonstration came as I watched the unyielding female activists viciously attacked by a group of young police women, which makes me think of the point made this morning by Dr. Bachelet about needing women to be gender sensitive too. And it was a terrible irony to watch because, of course, the career paths of these young police women in Algeria were only possible because of the hard work of some of the dedicated feminist activists that they scraped off the sidewalks. The women's human rights defender, Sharifa Kheder, who is the president of an organization called Jaza Eruna, an association of the victims of the fundamentalist terrorism of the 1990s, was arrested twice that day on February 12th. And I watched in horror as the police women manhandled her, which, as I wrote, is unfortunately not an oxymoron. Just before she was arrested the first time, Kheder was attacked by a group of the young pro-government protesters who were actually more dangerous in some ways to the demonstrators than the police. Some of these counter-demonstrators attempted to pull Sharifa's clothes off, while another attempted to simulate sex with her. And a policewoman finally dragged her away from this melee, only to help a group of male cops throw her to the ground and arrest her rather than the perpetrators. And this gives you some sense of the tremendous risks these valiant women human rights defenders are taking, whether here or in many other countries. A few days later, I spent the birthday of the Prophet Muhammad, which is a major holiday in Algeria, with a group of these women activists, discussing why they were taking part in the marches. Many of them are involved with a newly created coalition of women's rights groups known as the Observatory on Violence Against Women. They see what they called the women question as inherently a political question, and so their coalition joined the coordinating committee organizing the protests. They want issues like the abrogation of the discriminatory family code, for which religious justifications are often proffered, to be on the change agenda, and therefore we must march, they say. Taghayyur al-nizam, changing the system, as you heard the protesters chanting, for them also means absolutely ameliorating the condition of women and challenging social conservatism. I interviewed another woman who told me she was going to the protests even though she had to hide this from her family. I went in between the two marches that I attended, that is the 12th and the 19th of February marches, to interview people to try to understand what the grievances were broadly giving rise to the protests. And I visited one day a slum in Algiers, a neighborhood known as Bab el Oued, which was a stronghold of the Islamic Salvation Front during the terrible 1990s. So I was taken by activists from an NGO, a wonderful NGO called SOS Bab el Oued, to what used to be a parking garage, but was turned into what I can only term so-called housing. And I visited, among others, a young couple who lived in 2 Spartan rooms with their infant. My friendly hostess told me that her husband works as a security guard. She laid out her daily difficulties. My husband, she said, earns 10,000 dinars a month. That's about 130 US dollars. My son's milk costs 300 dinars a can, about $5. It only lasts a few days. His diapers cost another $750 dinars. That's about $10. How can we feed ourselves, she said. She tells me there are women nearby sleeping on cartons in the street, and she warns that things could explode here. She supports the marches, but she's not able to participate. She shows me how she plugged the gaps around her windows to protect her son from tear gas during early January's riots, and she says it will be much worse than January if it doesn't change peacefully. Several days later, on February 19th, 2,000 protesters again took to the streets, demanding that very peaceful change that the woman in Bab el Oued was so hoping for. This morning, again, they took to the streets, although unfortunately the opposition has now split in Algeria, so only part of that cohort took to the streets. But again, the women activists, I just talked to them, some of them on the phone, were kicked by riot police. Some of them were beaten, were prohibited from arriving at Martyrs Square, where they were attempting to protest this time, were again threatened with sexual assault by the counter-protesters. And they so deserve our solidarity in what will be an ongoing and long struggle for justice in Algeria. Now, I tell these stories for a number of reasons. The first is that I was deeply moved by what I saw, and Algeria is simply not getting the attention that some of the other countries are, perhaps understandably, given, for example, the terrible level of violence in Libya. But also, I think that these social movements are some of the most significant human rights developments of recent years, and I really just couldn't take the floor here today without speaking about them. But I also tell these stories because I believe that they are directly relevant to the topic at hand, which is applying what we have learned so far about culture, religion, and human rights in the work of UN Women. You see, no one on the streets of Algiers was making a demand based on culture or religion. Like women on the streets of Tunis and Cairo and Tehran in recent weeks and beyond, these women's rights advocates were demanding, and sometimes simply taking possession of, their universal human rights: freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of bodily integrity, economic, social, and cultural rights, the right to political participation, freedom from discrimination. When I visited Bab el Oued, none of the poor women I interviewed talked about religion or culture, which are, of course, integral parts of their daily lives, which I don't deny for a moment. But what they were concerned about and wanted to tell me about were their struggles for basic human rights, things like social security, cheaper milk, safety for themselves and their families, hope, just like anyone living anywhere else. No one made claims from a place of cultural or religious particularity, but rather as women, as citizens, as human beings. They were invoking their rights like any human being anywhere else. And I think this is a critical point in a liberal West where we have of late assumed everything to be about identity and difference when it concerns the people who live in Muslim-majority societies. If we shift to particularist discourses, sort of Muslim exceptionalist discourses about women's rights in certain parts of the world, in deference to arguments made by some about absolute cultural or religious difference, I believe we are undermining those women on the streets of Algiers in their quest for full citizenship as Algerians and as women. They do not want that quest for rights to be limited to a discourse of reinterpreting religion. They want their rights regardless of how one interprets religion, as many American women do, regardless of how one interprets religion in this society, which, as our moderator so rightly pointed out, is infused with religiosity. In light of this concern, I think one of UN Women's most important contributions could be as an unapologetic defender and promoter everywhere of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that touchstone instrument of the international human rights system and its core notion of universality. The UDHR starts with the idea that the same principles are meant to govern the rights of all human beings, regardless of their differences of gender, race, class, religion. Human beings qualify for human rights simply by being human wherever they live and whoever they are. I think universality can be a progressive and unifying idea. However, some critique universality, this has become quite fashionable, as being a Western construct, inappropriate elsewhere, and I disagree entirely. Some of universality's biggest critics are in the West, both on the left among postmodernists and others, as well as on the right, the American exceptionalists. Many of universality's most ardent defenders, and some of those who have risked the most to defend and define it, are located outside of the West, many in Muslim-majority societies. And I have seen such defense of universality, for example, firsthand in the work of Afghan women human rights defenders seeking to document cases of atrocities against women, notwithstanding the claim that it is shameful to publish such information. In the vigorous advocacy of the Pakistani women's rights movement currently fighting the blasphemy laws, and the work of Gambian women against FGM despite bogus prosecutions. Now, I'm going to skip a whole long section of my talk, if you bear with me. A lot of questions that I want to put on the table, but we'll come back to them. In closing, I wanted to say how proud I am today to be of North African heritage, something I've always been proud of, but I feel a special pride at the moment, given the profound courage and leadership being shown by women and men across the region fighting peacefully for universal human rights. And yesterday, North Africans, in fact, changed the face of international law and the United Nations itself forever, in ways that are profoundly moving. The incredible bravery of the Libyan people in revolting against dictatorship, despite the terribly high costs, provoked a special session of the UN Human Rights Council, at which the Libyan diplomats challenged traditional notions of sovereignty by saying they represented their people, not their government. And then the Council, never an especially courageous body before, unanimously agreed to recommend the suspension of Libya from membership in the Council due to the gross human rights abuses by its government. The Human Rights Council actually showed political, institutional courage. This is an amazing moment. What I hope, and I believe that this will be the case under the leadership of the wonderful Dr. Bachelet, what I hope, and we will have to support her in this, is that UN Women will show this sort of institutional courage at every step in defending the principle of universality, in challenging religious fundamentalism, which I didn't even have time really to say much about. And this will require what Sharifa Khadr, one of the Algerian activists, called a more courageous politics, something that even the UN Human Rights Council has shown this week to be possible. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much.
Well, as you can tell, she has a lot to say, and it's all my fault that she cut out the middle part. But I know in the question and answer session, you'll be asking questions that will allow her to more fully engage on some of these questions. Our next speaker is Leila Ahmed, and I've also told her that she can't give her entire long paper, but again, she's going to make her presentation, and then we can follow up in the question and answer session. So Leila, please.
Thank you. And I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me. It's been a great pleasure to be here as a participant. So 12 minutes on culture, religion, and human rights.
We told her 10. See, we're arguing.
And also say something about applying what we've learned. Okay, so I'm going to touch on some of these themes from the perspective of the work that I've been doing recently. And I've been working in particular on women in Islam in America. And as part of that, I've been following out also the larger public conversation today in America and Europe in relation to women and Islam. With respect to that larger conversation, it's clear that it's clearly the case that the subject of women in Islam has skyrocketed into high visibility in this post-9/11 era, and that it carries today a tremendous undertow of political significance. This topic, and most specifically not just women in Islam, but the oppression of women in Islam, now often figures in the media under a variety of guises, usually through a reference to the veil. The Chador of Afghanistan, some of you may remember when we first went to war in Afghanistan, was constantly in the media, and it was an easy way of both evoking at once the brutality of the Taliban and the moral justice of the war. In addition, the veil or hijab or headscarf is also a recurring theme in European political conversations, where talk of banning it is ongoing on the ground that it imports religion into secular space, and or that it is a sign of Islam's inherently patriarchal commitments, which are fundamentally at odds, it's claimed, with Western values, and in particular gender equality. These broad themes in our public narratives as to the perils of veiling and of Islam's supposedly unique oppressiveness towards women are not, of course, new to Western discourse. Their history goes back to early colonial times, but today they are re-emerging with renewed vigor. Such is the terrain in which we work and which forms the backdrop of our discussions of religion, culture, and human rights. Embedded as we are in the texture of our times, many of us surely are inevitably influenced by such narratives, even those of us explicitly working to contest their hidden and not so hidden agendas. Let me give an example from my own work. I began my research on women Islam in America in the late 90s because I was surprised by the growing veiling trend among the young, and my assumption was that this perhaps seemed to imply acceptance of patriarchal notions. The trend was in addition alarming to me because the style of hijab I was seeing reminded me of the hijabs I saw as a child worn by the women of the Muslim Brotherhood, and only the women of the Muslim Brotherhood. I thought it unlikely that the Brotherhood could possibly have influence in America, but I was wrong. In fact, many of the major American Muslim institutions were founded by the Muslim Brotherhood, or by people connected with them. And the reason the veil is here is very much to do with the Islamic revival, which was energized by the Muslim Brotherhood, which occurred in Egypt in the 70s and has now spread across the world. So, as I said, some of the major Muslim organizations, such as the Islamic Society of North America, or ISNA, were founded by people with connections to the Brotherhood. Or with other Islamists. And Islamist, I should explain, is the term that's now used in the scholarship to mean people connected with the Islamic revival of the 70s and later, and who, by and large, experts agree are non-violent and committed to non-violence. So armed with this knowledge, I continued my study to see how this kind of Islam was developing in America in relation to women. And in fact, my findings completely overturned my initial assumptions which were in sync with the grand narratives of our times as regards veiling as inherently affirming of male patriarchy, as I'd assumed, and as to the presumption of the dangers of the link to the Muslim Brotherhood and the assumption that it's always negative for women. For one thing, in the context of Western societies where Muslims are minorities, the veil has been cut loose from its old patriarchal meanings and now has a plethora of meanings, including among them the affirmation of gender justice. Similarly, my initial expectations were reversed when I followed out the activism of organizations such as ISNA, of women in those organizations. Often, these women were active in pursuing issues of justice for women, issues that in their eyes they were pursuing not because they were feminists, which is not how they see themselves, but out of their religious commitment to social justice. And for American Muslim women, social justice often typically includes justice also for women. So besides making clear to me my own prior implicatedness by virtue of my initial assumptions in the powerful Western narratives of our times, these findings also underscored another point, which in this case was not in fact a surprise, that is that Islam is being interpreted in America in a variety of ways, among them in ways that fully engage with and reflect the democratic society in which they are located. Such findings underscored, in other words, the fact that Islam is essentially no different from, no more intrinsically patriarchal than other major religions. I'm not, of course, claiming that all forms of Islam in America will necessarily endorse values of justice, social justice inclusive of women, but I'm simply confirming that, as is clearly the case with some forms of Christianity and Judaism, some forms of Islam, too, will continue to insist on the primacy of male dominance, while other forms will challenge that. So these are some of the things that have challenged my assumptions as regard religion, culture, and women's rights. Other events of our time similarly challenge old assumptions, among them the revolutions sweeping across the Middle East and North Africa. To say just a word in relation specifically to Egypt, we've had before us the spectacle of people, in particular young people, by the hundreds of thousands, even millions, risking their lives in a peaceful movement fueled by the desire for democracy, freedom, dignity, and human rights. Women, Christian and Muslim, hijabi and non-hijabi, formed part of the movement. And women were also among those whose words first inspired and ignited the movement. So while it's true that a call for equality for women has not explicitly been part of the revolutionary agenda, it's certainly there implicitly in women's activism and participation in the revolution. True, the economic and political empowerment of women is still a goal to be worked for, but what has already been achieved is certainly to be celebrated. What light, one might ask, does this revolutionary movement in the Arab world cast, for example, on the remarks made recently by Angela Merkel, Chancellor of Germany, and David Cameron, British Prime Minister, to the effect that multiculturalism is a failure in their countries, above all because Muslims apparently are incapable of adapting to the Western values of democracy and equality? How come Muslims in Cairo and Tunis are capable of being fired by a desire for liberty, democracy, and a fair and equitable society, but not apparently Muslims living in Berlin or London? The passion for pursuing social justice evident among American Muslim women is clearly also in evidence in the revolutions now rolling across the Muslim world, the Arab world. These shared desires among the younger generation are now surging forward across the seemingly hard boundaries of religion, culture, and even national boundaries. It may be then that these old categories are losing their usefulness today, but perhaps they belong now to a past and passing era. Now, to turn to applying what we've learned, my own direct experience of the practical application of knowledge in relation to religion, culture, human rights comes exclusively from my serving as a member on the board of Women's Learning Partnership, the organization about which we've heard a lot today, and which works mainly, as Mahnaz mentioned earlier, in the Global South. As board member, I followed the activities of WLP, and I attended meetings where I listened to inspirational women, such as you've heard today, describing their work in their different communities. Invariably, of course, I was moved, inspired, and impressed. I was always impressed, too, by the way that the WLP does its grassroots work in ways that are essentially free, so it seems, of the kinds of assumptions that are part of the grand narratives of our day about women and Islam. In fact, the gulf between the implicit presumptions underlying these grand narratives on the one hand and the useful, practical, and thoughtful work of support offered by WLP on the other seemed to me so striking that I found myself thinking that it might be a very good idea if WLP expanded their reach beyond the Global South, and if, say, Angela Merkel and David Cameron were to call them in to help them out, sort out their problems.
Thank you, Leila. I noticed you didn't offer them to the WLP to the Congress of the United States. Maybe they could use that assistance. Okay, next is Frances Kissling.
Are you doing 3 minutes, 2 minutes?
I'm doing 2 minutes.
2 minutes and wrap up.
Okay.
Well, here I am, only from America, not back from Algeria or Egypt, but I am back from a place called Liberty University. I was there. Liberty University, for those of you who do not know, is the nurturing ground for the intellectual and advocacy leadership of the Christian right in the United States of America. It was founded by Jerry Falwell, the late Jerry Falwell, one of the leading evangelicals who moved from a fundamentalism that eschewed engagement with the political world to a fundamentalism that has tried to change the face of America. So I have my war scars and stories too. This also, I just point of personal privilege, this is the university from which I graduated. I came here from the outer borough of Queens, New York, from a Roman Catholic college and a Roman Catholic background, into the heart of Manhattan in the early 1960s. I started with others the SDS chapter in this university. I was arrested for the first time in what is now called Dag Hammarskjöld Plaza. That was my first encounter with the UN, demonstrating against the war in Vietnam. I had sex for the first time, and I used birth control for the first time. In short, I became a modern woman here. So this place has wonderful, wonderful memories for me. It was also a time, and my remarks are going to be wholly American. It was also a time in this country when God was dead. Time magazine told us so, right on the cover. We didn't think, most people, or at least at an elite level and in the cultural level, God was really not talked about. Religion was not a topic of strong interest. It was a time, as we know, when civil rights were reaching a very high point. People of color were understood in the social construction to be the same and equal to white folks, and women too were achieving their rights. What has happened to America, and how did this happen? I've always had the theory that a lot of it has to do with economics. I did go to the New School, and political economy was a big deal here. Those things happened at the tail end of the post-World War II period in an America of prosperity and hope. We felt as there were more jobs, more people were able to buy homes. The belief was clear that your children would live a better life than you lived. And that sense of economic security, in my opinion, can create, in some cases it doesn't, can create a social generosity. We not only can afford to give rights to others or acknowledge that they have them, but we can allow people to live their lives in the light of the way they think and in the context of their own needs. And we saw, as America contracted economically during the Reagan years, these people became afraid. And fundamentalists, religious fundamentalists who were afraid of what had happened, entered the political space and played on people's fears. Now we are again, we never recovered from the Reagan years. Now we are again in a period of great economic distress. And fundamentalism again, religious fundamentalism, patriarchal fundamentalism, is very much on the rise. Those of us in the US feel extremely challenged by what we face. We face attacks not just on women's reproductive health in the context of the decision to have or not have a child in relation to abortion, but we face an all-out assault on basic family planning services. We face a major assault on women's rights in the economic arena. And much of this is undergirded by that nice place I went to visit in rural Virginia 2 days ago. You would be shocked at the quality of the place, the space, the endowment, the faculty, the students, women, men, African Americans in significant numbers, all of whom have been called by Christ, explicitly called by Christ, to save America as lawyers, politicians, community organizers. They do not eschew community organizing at Liberty University. This is what is planned in this context. For women, I want to talk a little bit about the women I met, because I think this is important. I met a woman who, at the end, very sweet, from southern Kentucky, who, as we talked about abortion, when faced with it, said, I guess if women have to go to jail for having abortions, I prefer that to abortion being legal. I talked to a young man who, heartthrob, gorgeous guy, who had been treated badly as a child by his parents, abused, and he ended up in Connecticut with a family where the woman had had 15 children. 15 children, and adopted 3, and he was one of those children. And we talked about family planning, sexuality, and he said, as we hear many young men of that group say, a little controversial, a little mixed up here, well, if I had sex with someone before I were married, I could never respect that woman. I said to him, I think the first person you might want to not respect is yourself. What do you think about that? And he agreed. He said, yes, you were right. The first person is I should take personal responsibility for this. But you can see just from little tidbits like that, the challenge at the cultural level that we face in the United States in terms of values. I got it. Okay. Don't even bother to get up. I'm a lucky person. I don't write my speeches, so it's much easier to come to closure. So I want to spend the last 2 minutes talking about the UN and UN women. I slipped out a little bit this morning, so I didn't actually hear this, but it was reported to me that one of the questions that had come up in the context of UN women was the idea of a fifth world conference on women. And Dr. Bachelet said that it would be great to have such a meeting if we could advance the agenda and not be, in essence, stymied or, distracted at such a meeting by the kind of fundamentalist opposition those of us who have been active in the UN since before Cairo have faced. And I guess the question I have is, why should we be preoccupied with that? Should we be preoccupied with that? Have we in some way allowed, and certainly I would say the answer, this is a rhetorical question, the answer is yes. We seem to have allowed within the UN system religious fundamentalists from the Rio conference who didn't know anything about the UN prior to 1992, who refused to engage in the UN prior to 1992, to have a privileged space within the United Nations. And it is now time to simply not allow that privileged space to exist. This is not just a question of the Holy See having a seat in the UN and trying to take the word empowerment out of the documents for this Commission on the Status of Women. This is a question of the role of all religion within the United Nations, NGOs, as well as the more official bodies. It is time, it seems to me, for us as women, and if UN women is a transformative agency. We should have developed by now the capacity to strategize on how to plan a meeting that cannot be derailed by those who disagree with the core agenda of the meeting. We can do this, and UN Women can and must lead the way, because fundamentalist religionists, and I'm closing with this, fundamental religionists have been more disruptive to the lives of women within the United Nations than in any other body. On an ancillary level, they have been disruptive to children. But essentially, they have worked hardest to create within the United Nations a patriarchal ideology that is structurally and institutionally consistent with a religious patriarchal ideology. And UN Women needs to do a lot of practical things. But the great thing, one of the great things that Thoraya Obaid did in UNFPA was to introduce a strong religious and cultural program. And in that context, I hope UN Women does the same, and I hope that it convenes the women of the world without fear and fearlessly to challenge any attempt of religious fundamentalism to hijack our agenda. Thank you very much.
This person is
an Indigenous
holding the
woman?
idea that Indigenous women face the same challenges that women do in regards to their rights in developing countries. And what are your thoughts on that? And how do we ensure that they're a part of the conversation?
Okay.
Hello, my name is Jessica Sauer. I'm with Sustain Us. Thank you for a very interesting panel. I had a lot to ruminate on. As someone who is pro-life and also considers themselves a feminist, it is interesting to be here. And someone that wants to see CEDAW passed, it's also important, I think, to bring conservative women into the scene. And I know that a lot of women feel prevented from coming in and participating with something like UN Women because they think it's only for liberals, which I think is very limiting. So my question is, how are you going to reach out to women that don't always align with all the political policies of UN Women, because it is supposed to be an organization for, as we said earlier, all women, even if all women aren't necessarily pro-women. So I guess my question is, how do we kind of incorporate differing political beliefs and making sure that UN Women is an open place for everyone to have a dialogue? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to go on this side now. Please, go ahead. Oh, are you okay in the front? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I would like to thank you all for speaking and for your passion. I'm Marie Ponceau. I'm a new member of an organization called ITSA, which is Independent Thinking and Social Action. It's a student-run organization to create curriculums for young women to have tools for critical thinking, but to use gender as that tool of like rethinking of about their own agency and their lives and patriarchy, but we work in such a small period of time and in more traditional communities, and with respect to their culture, and because it's supposed to be an international curriculum and something that can be applicable to all young women, but as a queer woman, I have arguments all the time with people in this organization, in that we want to cater to more fundamental women and teach them about their agency, but I want to raise questions about gender fluidity and sexuality that there's no safe space for. And so when there's no safe space for more complicated questions about women's rights, because queer rights are human rights as well, and most women organizations forget to talk about these issues as well because they overlap, I think it's important to raise those overlapping points. And so I guess I just want some insight on how, when working within cultural perspective and wanting to respect fundamentalism, but like how does one raise these issues, and how can we create awareness and critical thinking platforms for queer youth? Okay.
Thank you. Okay, next.
Good afternoon. I am Kenita Placid. I'm the alternate co-secretary general to ILGA, which is the International Gay and Lesbian Association. And I guess my question here this afternoon is, as we look at the whole cultural, religious, and human rights aspect, how can ILGA be more supportive in many ways to UN women? And we look at, we had persons speaking from the Muslim aspect, Algeria, you spoke generally, but then with dealing with gender mainstreaming and gender equality, I'd like to know what you think about trans persons and the roles they play in moving these, in pushing the agenda of the UN women.
Great, thank you. I'm going to take these two women and one woman, the person here, and then I'm going to stop and let the panel respond, and then we can take another round of questions. So, please. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Me?
Mm-hmm.
My name is Nair Javed, and I'm South Asian, older South Asian woman living in Canada. And thank you so much for creating this culture where the voices from South have gained some legitimacy in terms of that we also know how to solve our problems without the intervention by the West. Thanks a lot for doing that. And particularly, thank you so much for bringing in the commonality of what is the religious fundamentalism here as well as elsewhere in the world. With regard to universality of women's rights, it's not only the South, it's also those of us who are different living in the West. We have the same problems with regard to claiming our rights. Right away, our culture and religion is brought as a bargaining chip so that we do not demand equality. And I'll give you one example and then ask you to reflect on it. Well, this difference is deeply embedded in the colonialist ideology of the clashes of civilization, which emerge very clearly in the Western analysis of what is happening in the Middle East. Keeping that in view, I want to remind you that this difference is always used when we claim our rights in countries like Canada. And I'll give you the example of Sharia law, which Ontario government almost accepted at the time when Muslim organizations were raising questions about security legislation and the violation of our human rights in Canada. So it was used as a silencing strategy to silence the Muslim community. So I would like you to make a comment on how this has been used in silencing and disempowering culturally different, religiously different groups living in the West. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to take the young woman here, and then here, and then we're going to let the panel respond.
Sure,
So
thank
please.
you. My question is actually about the institutional sort of patriarchal nature of the UN itself, and especially, Ms. Kisling, after what you brought up, I'm just wondering how within this structure can UN women offer a more radical critique to the fact that the UN itself exists within a patriarchal free market capitalist society, and when UN Women itself is constrained by having to be funded by financial institutions like the IMF or the WTO, how can UN Women hope to bypass that? Can they hope to bypass that? And can it hope to address a more structural system in which it exists? Thank you.
Thank you.
This is Choi Chang. I come from Taiwan. I've been here for 11 or 12 years. But I see the change, so I have the deeply hope to UN women. Because in the past, people in Taiwan, women come here we join international NGO, so it's all freely we can get our pass. But since 3 years ago, if like me, I have American driver license, so I can come in. But for others, if they take Taiwan passport, they cannot be allowed. So even with like a Holy See, people can come. Why Taiwan people cannot come to? Because we are belong to INGO. INGO not involved into politics. It's true, some politics, but we shouldn't let politics interrupt women's freedom as international NGO group people to be attend and to voices. So I think I have a deep wish, like young women, not only restrict to member state people come. They should open to any INGO people if they like to come to be an observer and participants. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I said I'm going to stop here and let the panel respond, and then we'll pick up again.
Not a problem.
So, I don't know, should we go in the reverse order? Francis, you want to start?
Well, I'm going to take on only one or two of the questions, which I think is the best. We all don't have to comment on everything.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I'm going to take on the question from the person who is the woman who is pro-life, about how is it possible for those women who have a view that is not consistent in all ways with what seems to be the dominant perspective of UN Women and of the international feminist movement. I'm going to assume that your interest is to find a way to participate positively within the institution. And here are some of the things that I think those of you in that position can do. And I think there is a substantial, first I think UN Women needs to be open to a diversity of views. But I also think that those of us who hold views that are not dominant need to develop skills in terms of how to enter an arena where your views are not likely to, at first glance, be well received. I'm a Roman Catholic who's pro-choice. I've been doing this for 40 years. I think I might know a little bit, not that I've been all that successful, but a little bit about how to do that. The first thing I would say, is that you enter the arena with a burden of past bad behavior by colleagues. I'm assuming you are not any of those colleagues, in which the behavior has been lacking in graciousness, ungenerous, and only critical of the institution and its positions. That's not going to work. If you want to be a critic of that sort, then you won't play a positive role within any institution. So you have to enter the space willing to give up, for at least a time, some of your critique. Secondly, I would suggest you find something that UN Women is doing that you can agree with, and you work on that with which you agree. Prove yourself to be a good partner, and over time, begin to introduce questions in those areas where you have disagreements. And to do so at all times with generosity, graciousness, good manners, and a little bit of humor to those who disagree with you.
Thank you.
So thank you for all the excellent questions. I'm just going to tackle a few of them. The first one, the question about older women staying involved in struggles. Older women is increasingly a category I feel I might fit into when I see the age of some of the questioners. But I really wanted to pay tribute. There were older women than I on the streets of Algiers in the demonstrations, and one of the really beautiful things was intergenerational solidarity. I went to a meeting with some young bloggers. We've heard a lot about the young bloggers of late. some young Algerian bloggers with an organization called the Peaceful Algerian Collective, and there were some older women's rights activists there. And at one point, Amin Menadi, one of the bloggers, looked at the women with great respect, and he said, "Look, we need your experience, and you need our strength. So let's work together." And I was really moved by that. You also saw older women trying to talk to some of the younger male counter-protesters on the streets, calling them, my children, not in a patronizing way, but really in a way meaning to express solidarity. So I think older women are staying involved in the struggles, and it's up to the younger folks to really learn from the great experience they bring, while also moving to the fore as well. The question from our colleague from South Asia and Canada, just a few thoughts about that. One of the things that comes to my mind from something you said about the commonality of some of the problems, and I'm very deeply grateful to Frances for her talk about this, is a question I had in my talk that I really grapple with, and that is, why do only some people seem to have culture? Right? How did that happen? Yes. I had a discussion with my women's human rights students on some cases on violence against women last week, and one of the things I asked them to identify was the causes. And we talk about the case from Kenya, one of the causes is culture. We talk about the case from Turkey, one of the causes is religion. And we talk about the case from Pakistan, obviously religion. We get to the case from the United Kingdom, where a woman was killed by her husband, the policeman, who was protected by the cops. Nobody mentions culture. And I sort of asked them this question, and they really looked dumbfounded. But I do think there is this discourse in which only some people seem to have culture and religion. And in fact, some people seem to have only culture and religion. And that's really worrying to me. And one of, I think, the most brilliant things that Farida Shahid said in her report, and one of the critical things I think UN Women needs to do, is to support her in her important work, the UN Independent Expert on Culture. She said something quite simple, but it's important. All peoples have culture. So we have to get beyond this sort of exceptionalism and particularism in how we deal with these issues. And there's much more I could say, but I want to hear from Leila. Thank you.
Well, I'll comment just on, actually two that I see interconnected, the question about Indigenous women and the one about the Sharia in Canada. And actually to follow up on the last comment about culture. I don't know if if you look at the police reports in France of when there are murders of women, if it's a Frenchman, Euro-French or Euro descent, the reason is given that the murder was jealousy or fury or whatever it was. If it's someone of Muslim descent, it's culture or religion that's given as the reason for the murder. So you're absolutely right, and this is actually in police reports. So I think that the theme of the Sharia, I'm not aware of, I haven't followed that particular debate, but I do believe, and that was partly what I was trying to say, that the theme of women in Islam, the oppression of women in Islam, is a re-emerged theme today, particularly in relation to the war. As we are killing women in Iraq and Afghanistan, we are claiming to be saving them because Islam is so oppressive. So I do think you're absolutely right. There is politics going on in how this is happening, and I think the situation of Indigenous women is very parallel to any minority women that are struggling for their rights in this country. And in Europe.
A couple of questions that didn't get answered.
Yeah, I was going to answer the one on UN Women and the UN as a patriarchal structure.
On queer space, etc. All right.
Go ahead.
I would like to say to the young person who asked about working in an organization that is attempting to reach into new spaces, and to influence a more progressive view within those spaces, and the feeling that the theory of change that some people have, which is that you can only take on certain things, and other things have to stay outside the circle of discourse because they're just too controversial. I think there may be some merit to that argument, that we do want to be strategic about what we stress. And it may be that in some groups it is, but I think that we also have to be very careful not to over-censor ourselves. Our view of where other communities are on things, how people not be ready to accept certain things, may be wrong. I mean, often when you get to a certain level of abstraction from day-to-day people's lives, you think that they're less complex than they really are. Everybody is dealing with everything. Everybody has a gay, lesbian, queer, transgendered person, maybe not everybody, but this affects all of society. Everybody has a woman who has had an abortion. Everybody, all of these issues exist. I would just say to you that every person in the organization needs to be allowed to be themselves in an open way. That's the minimal requirement. And that issues may be taken on from time to time, but as long as the personality and identity of good people doing this work is allowed to be public, you will have an effect on those you deal with.
Great. Thank you. I think that was really important to respond to. I just want to say one word in response to the question about you working for UN Women in a patriarchal UN. Obviously, like all institutions, and this one is really dominated by men, that is a challenge. I think our new Undersecretary General is quite aware of that. She's been the president of a country. There are very few women who have done that and done it successfully and knows how to deal with men in power. But I think that, the one point that I wanted to make is we, all of us in NGOs and civil society, we are not UN Women. We want to partner with UN Women. We want to help UN Women be successful. But we are not in that institution. It is a different role. We each have different roles to play, and we can, by working together, we can achieve a lot. But I think it's important to remember that we in civil society, we have to hold UN Women accountable, just like we hold the UN accountable. Right. And we're going to work to make them as successful as possible, but they're not us, and we are not them. So. I know there is a woman. Yes, go ahead. And then I'm going to take a couple of women over here. Go ahead.
Hi. I want to make a comment, question about this, the call to universality. I really appreciate it.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Oh, I'm Dina Siddiqui. I'm an anthropologist. In fact, I taught at the New School many years ago for a couple of years. I guess, and this relates to some of the other questions that are going around. I think one of the things that, and I appreciate this call to universality, but as Leila Ahmed also pointed out, there's a real politics underlying what we think of as universality, and we really need to be very, very careful about how not becoming complicit in how other people are using what universality is. And as we know, as you keep pointing out, the war on terror has used a particular notion of what culture and cultural difference is in order to promote its, the US and others, and Europe have promoted its own agenda. So I think we need to look at what UN Women really needs to look at is also actually engage with the politics of knowledge construction particularly about what is considered to be culture, and a critique of universality need not be a support of cultural relativism. And I want to actually add something about the question on queer rights. Last week, in fact, in the last month, there have three very wonderful people from two queer rights activist groups from Palestine came. And I went to their talk last week in New York. And one of the things that they kept mentioning over and over is that you cannot talk about queer rights in Palestine, or the struggle for queer rights in Palestine cannot be separated from the struggle against the occupation. You can't even, when you can't cross from one part of Jerusalem to another to go to a supposed queer rights meeting, then your whole life is actually enveloped by how you're defined as a non-citizen, for instance. So I don't think the question is whether necessarily cultures are ready. The question is, why do we take up some things as culture and not other things? You know, and I think it goes back to what Karima Banoun just said a little while ago about some people having cultures and other people don't. So the problem can't just be reduced to culture. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Please.
Hi, my name is Ayana Najum. I'm senior editor at Global Woman magazine. And for the last, say, 15 to 20 years, the issue of FGM has been creeping into countries like the United States and other countries that are not, as you talk about culture, considered traditional practices, like in the Middle East and Africa. I know that the UN has spoken and been very concerned about the issue of FGM for quite a long time. How can we, and what Global Woman has decided to do is to take FGM on as a major issue, and we'll be launching a campaign next year against FGM, utilizing the support and partnership of other magazines around the world, as well as engaging NGOs and other organizations that are interested in this subject matter. The question is, when I talk about FGM to people in this country, you know, the Americans are very visual, so you've got to go in and say, well, you know, they hold a baby girl down, they take the razor blade, they spread her legs, they cut it down, do you see the blood dripping, you know, and then people say, oh, too much information, I don't need to hear all that. How do you engage cultures, countries like the U.S. in this conversation where they understand what's happening to women around the world, whereas with what's happening here with Congresswoman Mary Bono and Congressman Crowley are introducing legislation for the second year on this subject matter, where people really understand that it doesn't have to be exactly in your neighborhood to support and engage a campaign against something that's so critical to women around the world. 8,000 girls a day are being cut. 130 million women have been cut. And then they say, but it's a Muslim thing. That's something that happens in the Middle East. That doesn't happen in our neighborhood. Can you speak on that and how we can come together around subjects like this, where it's not happening necessarily in New York City, but it happened in Georgia and they send somebody to prison about it?
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Please, go ahead.
My name is Nikhat Khan. I'm from Pakistan, and I know it always rhymes. It's always a mess. I enjoyed this session very, very much, and I sort of have I guess a question or something, but it's linking all three. Karim, I was delighted that you raised the whole issue of universality, because actually in Pakistan, when women are fighting for land rights, or they're fighting for the fisheries rights, or inheritance, or domestic against domestic, they've never referred to Islam. They actually are fighting for those rights. But the problem is, and here I link it to what Leila says, that because of these multiple identities, and because identities emerge under certain circumstances of which one gets privileged, and because you did refer to the Muslim Brotherhood, you get a whole range of these brotherhoods of different types, which then actually inform our way of looking at what is Islam and whether we're going within it or outside it. So today, a Pakistani woman 10 years ago, 20 years ago, would never have referred to Islam at all. Today, she may be in the position where she's either backing off or she's sort of trying to justify it by saying inheritances in the Quran, or some reference actually to being made to that. So this whole issue of when you assert the question of insecurity, the question of othering, does one come first or what comes first, etc. And that links up to what you were saying, Francis. I don't know why you mentioned 1992, but 1992 is when we date ourselves because of the end of the Soviet Union, clash of civilizations, that othering by Mr. Bush, the other Mr. Bush, that there's you versus us. And that actually did divide, because that's, Karima, when we got into the whole issue of justifying it in the name of Islam, or validating it in terms of religion or culture or whatever. But I mean, I agree totally, and I'm very pleased that you raised this issue that there is, in fact, cultural specificity. That debate is not been a debate within our countries, but it's a debate that we've sort of somewhere got and become a part of.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm going to there are two people over here, and then you'll be the last person, because I want to make sure the panelists have a chance to respond to the many questions that have been asked. So if you can try to ask the questions a little bit more brief.
So I'm Siham Habshi. I'm the president of a French women organization called Ni Pute Ni Soumise, neither whore nor submissive.
Neither
whore nor submissive. We are not whore and we are not submissive. Okay. So this organization, yes, we need to be respected, that's all. So you talk about the French police that the French police said that when a woman goes and at the police station, they register the origin, okay, on the man. It doesn't exist in France. It's illegal to register the origin. So it's a question because we fight in our country all against forced marriages and all stuff that kill us. Sohan has been burned alive in 2003 because she is a girl, because she was a woman. She was living in the poor area and she has been burned alive because she said no. Okay, so the question is, how can we be protected? Not because we are from this origin or this religion, but just because we need to be protected as a citizen, as a woman. You know, we need to change that. You know, when we talk about universal values, listen to what's happening right now in our country of origin. From Tunisia to Algeria to Yemen to other countries, women and men are shouting, we can be free. We can be free, and democracy can exist in our country. My second question is why in the UN Women there is a silence about what's going on right now in Libya, in all this country, in Tunisia. We need to have a statement in the UN Women, but also from all the NGOs who are here in the United Nations to denounce what's happening and to support the women inside any negotiation, inside the commission that is creating the new constitution in Egypt, etc., etc. Just please, universal rights could be for all of us, not only in our democratic country like France and Europe. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
My name is Diane Smalley. I'm an ordained clergy person in the Presbyterian Church USA. I'm also from Detroit, and at root I'm a Southerner, birthed in the civil rights movement. Right. And I probably would not be an ordained clergy woman had it not been for the civil rights movement. So I know that you know that there is a movement called Ecumenical Women that's progressive and willing to be a partner, and we are not afraid to take on fundamentalism. So think about that. Use us.
Thank you. Please.
My name is Joyce Brock. I'm a physician, and I represent 3 organizations: the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, the American Medical Women's Association, and the Netherlands Council of Women.
Maybe, I think, could you speak up a little?
Okay, and the Netherlands Council of Women. I would preface my question with a quote from an Episcopalian priest that I met, and speaking about violence against women, and which is very often enshrined in the dogma of many fundamentalist ends of religions. And what she said is, we need to remember that we agree that God made man. We must also agree that man made religion. So I would like to talk about, have you address the plasticity of culture, the fact that tradition comes from the past and is going to the future, and at present it is subject and amenable to change. And how do we do that? But we have this, I'm a little upset by the idea that culture, and as an American, I can tell you, I find it very difficult when people talk about cultures as if I don't have one. Mine may be informed by my ethnic origins, but it very definitely is my culture. And but it seems to be absent. So would you address plasticity of culture and tradition and the fact that even religions are changed by men and then women?
Thank you. Okay, I said that was going to be the end. Is your question really brief? No, you sure?
It's really brief.
Very brief. Go ahead. Okay.
Hello, my name is Rumana Rizk, and I represent the Mata Amritananda Math from South India, MA Math, and Peace Lights based in Lebanon and the US. It's really a very short question. Why are we still talking about the human rights, translated in French, les droits de l'homme? Is there something that's changing? Is there a movement changing that? I mean, it's upsetting.
Okay, thank you. She's saying, why is it droit de l'homme? Human rights.
I don't have any answers to any of those questions.
Okay. Do you want to go first? No. Okay. Karima, why don't you go first?
Okay. Thank you again for these wonderful questions. Dina Siddiqui's excellent question about universality. You're absolutely right. There are perfectly legitimate critiques of universality, especially hegemonic universalities. Universality is a work in progress. That's a big part of the speech that I cut out. But I would also say that there, just as universality can be misused by imperialist critiques of universality, can be misused by fundamentalists and the right, and that happens a lot too, and that's a danger we have to be very careful of. I think in the context of the war on terror, because of Islamophobia and gross human rights abuses committed by the Western governments and other governments in the course of that so-called war, the human rights movement, human rights forces have often kind of turned to a sort of cultural relativism. We have stopped being willing to challenge certain human rights abuses in Muslim-majority contexts, including when women in those communities and societies are doing so, and we sometimes have instead defended the fundamentalists who certainly have been in certain contexts the victims of Western and other governments, but forgotten the victims of those same fundamentalists. So I think there are a set of interlocking challenges here that we have to grapple with. When I made my point about when I asked the question, why do only some people have culture, that was a multi-directional critique. I don't think I made it clear. That is not only a critique of imperialism and racism that is blind to culture in the West or in the North, but it is also a critique of cultural relativism that can only see culture in the South and is unwilling to go sort of to the universality space with all of its difficulties. The question about multiple identities. I think this is an incredibly important question, and what it made me think about was the fact that we talk about culture as if it were a thing. I'm not an anthropologist, but I think it's actually a set of processes, and they are interpreted through politics, and they are constantly changing. And in fact, CEDAW actually says that you're supposed to change culture when it leads to discrimination against women, which is somehow something that disappears entirely out of this discussion because culture becomes this immutable, static, untouchable thing. So that's just something to think about. Othering, I think this is a huge issue. But I also think there are multiple otherings going on. Sometimes we think the solution to sort of hegemony is to talk about the West and the rest, or the West and its others. And the world, to me, just looks a lot more complicated than that. There are multiple otherings going on both sides of that sort of false dichotomy. And I wrote this paper recently called The Others Others that tries to grapple with this, because I think about what the women or men at Liberty University would think of all of us. We're on the same side of the so-called clash of civilizations, allegedly, but not actually. And the same thing is true. The women on the streets of Algiers, those feminist protesters, are absolutely the other for some of those young counter-protesters who were chanting in favor of an Islamic state. And let me just say, the last thing, for those women, their culture includes this. This is the sign that they held up. Which says in French and in Arabic, musawa, equality. And that they would claim as much a part of their culture as anything else.
Who wants to go next? You want to go next?
I only have one sentence.
Yes. Okay, one sentence.
I don't have any answers to any of the questions that were asked or comments that were asked in the second round. They were all very insightful thoughts. that we take away with us. I'm only going to say one simple thing. In one of the UN documents, and I think it is Beijing, it says religion and culture cannot be used to justify the violation of women's human rights.
Yeah.
To the extent that we buy that expression, the job of UN women is to be sure that to the extent that religion and culture does work to violate the human rights of women, it must be a central piece of the work of UN women.
Thank you.
Well, I also don't, like Franz, don't have, I'm enormously impressed by all the questions. They're all wonderful. I don't have the answers. And there's one thing that I should note. Somebody said that you're not allowed in France to register the ethnicity or the religion. My source for the claim that in the police reports say a crime to do with cultural religion is John Bowen's book called Why the French Don't Like Headscarves. So if he's wrong, then he's wrong. I don't know the source of that. And just maybe I think on the last question about the plasticity of religion and culture and something else, and I can't remember what the third thing was, and that they're made by men. I think the only key, I completely agree, they are. All you have to do is look at the history of religion and see how it changes from decade to decade, or at least certainly from century to century. What Christianity is today is not what it was in the 19th century in America. Similarly, exactly the same with Islam. In fact, I've lived through a revolution in Islam. The Islam that I see around me, I don't recognize. I was raised in a different kind of Islam, and time changes it. The only point I would add to them, these are made by men, these changes are made by men, is they're made by women too. Women also are critical participants in culture, religion, and everything else.
Well, it's been a wonderful panel. And all I can say in closing is I want to thank Manaz and the Women's Learning Partnership for enabling this dialogue, and maybe that is something UN Women could continue to have, a dialogue where women are speaking for themselves about what these actually mean in their own experience. So thank you very much.